Around 1:30 p.m. on the afternoon of May 18, 2007, a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a park in Rotterdam, which is a city in the Netherlands. She was there to meet up with her friend, and she had to cut through the park to get to his house. Yvonne went to her friend's house almost every day. And usually when she walked through the park during the week, there weren't that many people around. But on this day, it was really crowded because it was the Friday of a long weekend, and there was just a lot of families and visitors that were enjoying the spring weather, which meant the playground, the pathways, and the park's little cafe were all packed. But Yvonne didn't pay that much attention to the crowds because she was busy thinking about her friend. They'd known each other for years, and they had what she considered to be a very special connection that Yvonne didn't think she had with anybody else. Now, Yvonne knew that a lot of people might say her and her friend's relationship was sort of more strange than special. In fact, some people in her life actually openly disapproved of it. But for Yvonne, it seemed like the main reason for that was, Yvonne was generally pretty friendly and social and sort of an outgoing, normal person, but her friend was extremely reclusive and never left his house, and so it just seemed like an odd pairing. Her friend was originally from Germany, but even though he'd lived in the Netherlands now for years, he had never learned the language. So he really couldn't communicate with anybody, including Yvonne, at least not in her native tongue. But for Yvonne, if anything, the fact that people didn't necessarily think this was a good idea for them to be friends just made her feel more protective of her friend. And also, she was especially sympathetic to the fact that her friend had actually been abandoned by his mother as a child. And so in a way, she sort of felt like she was stepping in as sort of a maternal figure in her friend's life. And so Yvonne, she rounded a corner on the park's path, and up ahead, there was her friend's house. And she could actually see her friend through one of the windows. And he did not look particularly happy. He looked sort of dejected. And so as she approached, she made a big scene to be very smiley and happy, and she's waving to her friend. And sure enough, her friend at some point turned and looked out the window and saw Yvonne approaching, and he broke into a big smile and he waved back. It's like even though they didn't speak the same language, there clearly was a connection there. And Yvonne was just filled with happiness, so glad that she was here to see him. And so Yvonne, she made her way over to her friend, and that day really was spent the same way they spent all their other days together, which, again, they don't speak the same language, so it was just sort of a lot of, body language and gestures and sort of just sitting together and just sort of enjoying each other's company. There wasn't really any direct communication happening, but this was a unique relationship, and for Yvonne, whatever it was enough for her. And she felt like for her friend, it was reciprocated. He appreciated their time together, and that was enough. But even though Yvonne in particular really looked forward to these visits and was having a really nice time on this particular day, she couldn't stay forever. She had a family and other things she needed to get done. So at around 2:30 p.m., after having spent about an hour with her friend, she said goodbye to him, and then she turned and left, knowing that the two of them would see each other again soon. And so Yvonne, after turning and leaving her friend's house, she only got a few steps down the path she came in on when two things happened at once. The first thing was she noticed there was a group of kids in the park who were throwing rocks, and she knew instinctively, the kids should not be throwing rocks. So that sort of registered. She wasn't doing anything about it, but she was just aware that there are children throwing rocks nearby. And then the second thing she noticed is she heard splashing coming from behind her. She didn't think it was coming from the kids throwing rocks. She's thinking it didn't rain anytime recently, so there's no reason that there'd be splashing sounds around her. There's no puddles or anything. The only splashing that made sense was it was coming from this stream that was sort of off limits in the park. Nobody had access to it. There was no reason to get down there to that stream, but it sounded very much like that was the splashing that she was hearing. And so Yvonne, she's just consciously aware of these things happening. This was not something that was alarming. She's just aware. And so she found herself turning around to see in particular what that splashing sound was. And as she turned around, something huge smashed into her, pinned her to the ground. All she could hear was screaming throughout the park. And the last thought she had before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not far away, a man named Arvid Hendricks, who had also come to this same park with his wife and his two kids, heard the screams echoing through the park. He was right outside the cafe that Yvonne had been walking towards, and he had just been about to go inside when all this commotion had started. So this particular cafe sat on a path that cut through the park itself. It was a small place, almost like a glorified snack bar, and it had a big pavilion right in front of it with outdoor seating that looked out over the park. And from Arvid's perspective, as he was standing on that pavilion near the cafe entrance, he could hear these people screaming and actually started to see them running in his direction. But Arvid had no idea what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It just seemed like all of a sudden everybody's panicking and coming this way. And so instinctively, Arvid's thinking, okay, there's something threatening going on, and he needs to make sure his family is safe before he even knows what the threat is. So he grabbed his kids and his wife, and he ran into the restaurant along with everybody else. And remember, this restaurant, this cafe, was not huge. Inside, it sort of felt like a dining hall with large communal tables. And so with all these people rushing inside, this place quickly became chaotic. And then after all these people came inside, a few of the people went forward and did their best to barricade the front doors. Even though they were glassed and would be pretty easy to break through, they did what they could to sort of block them off. After this, despite there still being this really intense energy sort of buzzing around the room, things actually kind of calmed down. Arvid and probably many other people in this cafe did not know what was going on. They had just sort of reacted instinctively and went in here, assuming there has to be some real threat out there. Let's take shelter. And so there's this weird lull period where everyone's kind of looking around, Arvid included, trying to figure out, is there really a big threat out there, or are we overreacting here? And as they're all sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, the front doors, the glass doors, suddenly shatter. And once again, the whole group is thrust into absolute chaos once again, as all the parents are grabbing their kids, and even though they still don't really know what's going on, they're trying to rush towards those shattered doors to get out of this place, which now feels like it is dangerous, in some ways worse than outside. And so it's this huge bottleneck as the door, as everyone's screaming, there's just madness happening. And Arvid, he could tell there was no way he could get through this cluster of people desperately trying to get out. And so he just grabbed his wife and his kids, and they went under one of the tables and they hid. And for the next couple of minutes, everything all around Arvid and his family continued to be absolutely chaotic and madness. But then eventually, everything just went quiet as everybody else made their way out of the cafe. And it was just Arvid and his family sitting there wondering what the heck is going on. And for a moment, Arvid felt like, okay, I'm safe. I don't know what's going on, but me and my family, we are safe. However, before he instructed his kids and his wife to come out of their hiding spot, he heard the sound of more glass shattering, and then he heard these loud stomping sounds as something huge was making its way through those front doors into the cafe. And suddenly, it hit Arvid when he looked out and saw what it was, why everybody was running. And he also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out all the people in Yvonne's life who frowned on her special friendship had been right to do so. Because although Yvonne loved her daily routine with her friend did not actually feel the same way. Every day when Yvonne went to visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company. And Yvonne's friend would smile back at her. This was sort of the rapport they had developed, at least in Yvonne's mind. The smiling back and forth suggested they were friends. What Yvonne didn't realize is that them smiling back and forth was actually something her friend hated. And on that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park that surrounded his house was so crowded and so loud, and those kids who Yvonne saw throwing rocks when she left had been doing it earlier. They were throwing rocks that whole time that she was visiting with her friend, and some of those rocks were hitting her friend's house, and it was making him so agitated and mad. And then the whole time through this interaction, Yvonne is smiling over and over at her friend, thinking this is so great, and it just totally sent her friend over the edge. And so when Yvonne finally left and walked away, the friend, should have felt relieved because now, one of the things that was really agitating him was gone. Yvonne, she was gone. But the friend knew she wasn't really leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow like she always did with that same enraging smile on top of all the other things that were so annoying. And the friend just could not take it any longer. So he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limits stream in the park to get to Yvonne as she walked away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at Yvonne before she could smile at him. And for once, she didn't smile back. Instead, she looked terrified. And this was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Boquito. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, smiling is not a sign of friendship. It's a sign of aggression and hostility. So it's very likely that from Boquito's point of view, almost every day for years, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure, in essence, to threaten him. At least that's very likely how he interpreted it. And he had been basically threatening her back whenever he smiled by showing his teeth. And he thought maybe that would get her to go away, but it never worked. She always came back and just continued to threaten him. And so eventually, like the story goes, it became too much. Luckily though, Boquito didn't harm really anybody except for Yvonne. He bit her over 100 times and broke multiple bones, but Yvonne did survive. But no other guests were harmed, including Arvid and his family. They were trapped in that cafe with Boquito, who after attacking Yvonne had charged in there and was walking around, but Boquito never attacked. And so at a certain point, Arvid and his family were able to run to safety. After she recovered, Yvonne would tell the media that Boquito was still her darling. That's what she called him. And in fact, she would go back to the zoo to see Boquito after that. But this time, she didn't smile. The next and final story of today's episode is called Off the Bus. At 3 a.m. on August 11, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ali Dogan sat in the front seat of a passenger bus as it headed down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ali and about 50 other passengers were on their way from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, which is the largest city in Turkey, and they were about 3 hours into a 5-hour trip. Ali had passed the time so far by speaking with the man who just happened to be sitting next to him. He was an Air Force lieutenant. The lieutenant told Ali that originally he had actually been booked to take a flight to Istanbul, but he had missed the flight, and so here he was on the bus. But he told Ali that actually he was really enjoying this bus ride. He had never been on a long bus ride before, and critically, he had scored the very front seat in the bus, so he could basically see out the front window of the bus. And so for him, that was kind of exhilarating. And for Ali, he had actually switched spots with a previous passenger who had been sitting next to the lieutenant when they first boarded. He had switched with that person because Ali, the reason he was switching, was he wanted that view too. And so he and this lieutenant were sort of bonding over their shared excitement over, watching the road as they drove for hours on end. Ali and the lieutenant spoke in very quiet voices since almost everybody else on the bus was fast asleep. But these two, they're pumped, they're watching the road, they're talking about it quietly. But at a certain point, Ali, despite his enthusiasm for this ride, he started to feel pretty drowsy too. Ali was on his way back to Istanbul where he went to college. And later that day, because right now it's 3 a.m., later that day, he had a big exam. And he knew that as much as he wanted to stay up and sort of enjoy the ride, he really needed to get some sleep. So he took his sweatshirt and rolled it up like a pillow, put it behind his head, told the lieutenant he was going to sleep for a bit, and then he put his head back and closed his eyes. However, about 15 minutes later, when Ali was just really beginning to actually fall asleep, the bus was suddenly filled with screams, and Ali, he opened his eyes and he was looking out forward in the direction the bus was going, and he saw these bright headlights bearing down on the bus, and he knew they were about to collide with somebody on the road. And then the bus hard swerved to the right, and Ali's trying to hold on to the partition to keep himself seated, and he's getting ready to smash into this other vehicle, but right at the last second, the bus turns and slams off the road and comes crashing down in this ditch right off the side of the road. And then the bus kind of lurched to a stop because the bus driver was able to stop the crash. And for a second, Ali's looking around. Everyone's so shaken up by this. And he's feeling, very relieved that they did not smash into an oncoming car. But despite feeling that relief, Allie quickly realized they had another problem. The bus was starting to fill with smoke. And so Allie and the lieutenant, in virtue of sitting at the very front of the bus, were the closest to the door leading off the bus. And now clearly everybody needs to evacuate. There's some kind of fire that's happening because of the crash they've just been in. And so Allie and the lieutenant, they stand up, and the bus is kind of at a slant here because they're in this ditch. And they go up to the very front of the bus, and they actually look out the cracked front windshield, and they see there's this huge truck also in the ditch on the side of the road. And they're figuring that they must have collided in some way, like that was the truck that forced the bus off the road. And so it's like, okay, they've gotten into this accident. There's clearly a fire. We just got to get off this bus. And so Allie and the lieutenant, they get to the door and they try to open it. But the way the bus kind of crashed into this ditch, it sort of warped the frame of the bus. And so the lieutenant, he got down there and he began smashing on this door to try to open it up. And as this is happening, the smoke is getting much more intense inside of this bus, and all the people on the bus, the 50 some odd passengers behind them, they're starting to panic. Everyone's rushing forward, bumping into Allie and the lieutenant, trying to get off this bus. And then finally the lieutenant, he manages to force open the doors. And the second he does, this additional rush of black smoke comes pouring into the bus. It's like you can't even see anything. Everyone's choking and screaming. And the lieutenant, he just yells to Allie to go, get out, jump out. And so Allie, he's the first one off the bus. He climbs down the steps. All he sees is smoke everywhere. He really has no idea where the fire is actually coming from. And so instinctively, he just jumps out of the bus, just jumps as high and as far as he possibly can. And he actually hits the other side of the ditch. And he kind of stumbles and climbs up and gets away from the bus. And as soon as he did, he turned around and he's looking at the bus. And it's nighttime, but even still in the darkness, he just sees the bus is completely engulfed in all this smoke. He can't quite tell where the fire is. He's thinking, the engine must have caught fire and it's spreading across the undercarriage of the bus, but it's getting so bad. And he's hearing all the people on board desperately trying to get off out that door the lieutenant had forced open. But there's some kind of bottleneck. They're not getting out. It's like they're stampeding towards the front of the bus. People are screaming. It's chaos. And then Allie hears some of the windows being pushed open. People start jumping out the windows. I mean, they are desperate to get off this bus. And at first, what Allie hears are screams of what sounds like desperate and scared people just trying to evacuate. But quickly, those screams, when the folks started coming out of the bus, turned to pure agony. But as Allie is listening to this and watching this disaster unfold, he's thinking, okay, well, the reason they're screaming is because it's possible they could be catching on fire here, or maybe, they're jumping off and breaking bones or getting hurt from leaping out the window, and that's all terrible. But people are getting out of this bus, and before long, they're going to come up and over that side of the ditch, and they're going to join me. Like, these people, they're coming out of the bus. I'm seeing it happen. But all that happened is the screams of agony got louder and louder, and nobody came over that ditch. It was Allie all alone, and he had no idea why. All he sees is smoke, and all he hears is screams. And then at some point, authorities show up, and they clearly are right into the fray, trying to extinguish whatever fire is going on and trying to get people out and away from the bus. But despite this huge effort that Allie's watching happen right in front of him, granted it's obscured by the smoke, still nobody, including the lieutenant, came over the ditch to come be with Allie. He was all alone. But eventually, Allie noticed a few of the authorities that had shown up to assist in this emergency were walking away from the smoke in the bus, carrying what appeared to be bodies. But as Allie stared at these people carrying these bodies, he realized they weren't whole bodies. They were body parts. It would turn out most of Allie's and the rest of the passengers' assumptions about exactly what happened in that crash were correct. The bus they were riding in did swerve after seeing the headlights of an oncoming vehicle, and it did hit that big truck they saw on the side of the road when Allie and the lieutenant first got to the front of the bus and looked out. That was the truck they hit. Now, it was not a head-on collision. It was sort of a glancing blow as the bus swerved to avoid a head-on collision, but that crash sent the bus off the road into the ditch, and it was that crash into the ditch that ultimately prompted all that smoke. But they were all wrong about what was causing that smoke. there was no fire. The truck that the bus narrowly avoided the head-on collision with, but did ultimately strike, causing both the bus to crash and the truck to crash, that truck was a shipping truck, and it was transporting a huge amount of freight to Istanbul. And the collision burst the truck's shipping containers, and so the contents of those containers, the freight itself, poured out into that ditch. And that ditch that basically the bus had landed inside of, that Ali had sort of jumped over on his way to get out of the bus, and that others were sort of falling into when they were coming out of the bus to avoid this, fire, or so they thought. It already had some water in it when that freight entered into the ditch. So the freight and the water combined. And that combination caused a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction caused the smoke. Because that freight was nitric acid, a highly corrosive, highly toxic liquid chemical that now, despite being diluted by the water in the ditch, had basically filled the ditch. The ditch is now effectively an acid bath that's smoking, giving the impression the bus is on fire. And so all these folks are leaping out of the bus and landing in the ditch, which again is an acid bath, and they're being dissolved by the acid. Ali, when he left the bus first, he leapt out of the bus. He thought there was the fire right there, and he jumped up and out trying to clear the fire. And what he really did is he cleared the acid bath and landed on the other side, avoiding dissolving in the acid. But virtually everybody else in the bus was going right into the acid. And so in the end, of the nearly 50 people on board that bus, 26 literally dissolved to death.
On the night of Monday, December 2nd, 2013, 59-year-old Patty Wheelington walked across a gravel parking lot toward her favorite place in Texarkana, Arkansas, the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Patty was the owner of the club, a spot where club members from town got together each week to socialize and square dance, which is a traditional type of partner dance that had once been extremely popular in the American South and West. Patty had managed the club for years with her husband Ray, but Ray had died a year earlier, leaving Patty to run things on her own with some help from the most dedicated club members. The couple had always considered Guys and Dolls to be like their second home, and now that Ray was gone, Patty felt like this club was the most important thing in her life. And tonight was her first day back at the club since taking a short trip for Thanksgiving, so she was looking forward to seeing some of her friends and getting back into her weekly routine. Patty opened the front doors, stepped inside, and her face immediately lit up. This old-fashioned dance hall was housed in a metal building that almost looked like a large storage unit from the outside, but the inside was bright and festive. String lights and decorations hung along the walls, and Patty saw a group of older women dressed in colorful Western skirts and petticoats, and older men wearing their cowboy boots and hats. And everybody was socializing and laughing and having a great time while filling up their paper plates with food. The moment Patty walked inside, the club members turned, saw her, and shouted hello, and some rushed over to greet her like she'd been away for months. They told her they'd been anxiously waiting for her to come back because they hadn't known what to do with themselves while the club was closed over the holiday. She told them how much she missed them too, and thanked them for getting everything set up for the night. As she talked, Patty heard somebody calling her name. She looked over at a long table lined with food, and she saw two of her closest friends waving to her. They were Phyllis Neighbors and Virginia Hyatt. Patty went over to the table, and the women hugged each other and talked about their Thanksgiving holidays until Patty noticed it was almost time to start the night's dance. Patty walked across the dance hall, got up on the stage and tapped the mic, and then welcomed everyone back to the club. And immediately everybody cheered and took their spots on the dance floor with their partners. Well, at least almost all of them cheered. As Patty looked out from the stage, she noticed one of the couples whispering to each other while pointing her way. Patty almost tripped over her words as she began wondering if that couple was talking about her. But she quickly caught herself and figured she was just reading too much into it. So she wrapped up her welcome back speech and then led club members in saying the Pledge of Allegiance, which they did every time before they danced together. Once the pledge was finished, Patty, with a huge smile on her face, started the music and kicked off the dancing for the night. And as she watched everybody out on the dance floor, this sense of almost complete calm came over her. She knew most people would laugh at her for thinking this, but she believed being up on the stage and running this square dance club was her true calling. It was a way for her to give back to her community and to help the people she loved continue to thrive. The next morning, around 7:50 a.m., Patty stood in the kitchen of her home and poured herself a fresh mug of coffee. She slid her phone and pack of cigarettes into the pocket of her bathrobe and walked outside onto her front porch. A blast of cold winter air immediately hit her, so she pulled her bathrobe tighter across her body, sat down in a swivel chair, and set her coffee on a small wooden table and lit a cigarette. Now, in the past, on a cold day like this, Patty would have very likely just smoked inside of her home. But more than 5 years earlier, a raging fire had ripped through her home and destroyed half of it. Now, the blaze wasn't caused by a lit cigarette. In fact, the fire had started while Patty and her husband Ray weren't even at home. But they had hired a good friend of theirs from the Square Dance Club, who was a contractor, to restore their house, and he'd done such an amazing job overseeing the construction project that the house looked almost brand new. So now, Patty would never risk lighting a cigarette inside, no matter what the weather was outside. Patty smoked her cigarette and sipped her coffee, and just when she started to feel like she was really waking up, her phone rang. She put her coffee down and grabbed her phone out of her pocket. She looked at the caller ID and saw it was one of her many friends from the dance club, so she answered it. A few minutes into the conversation, Patty heard a car slowing down just beyond the trees at the edge of her property that isolated her house from the main road. Patty's friend kept talking on the phone, but Patty was no longer listening. She heard the car turning up her long gravel driveway toward her house, and she wondered who would be visiting so early without telling her they were coming by first. Patty watched as this car emerged from the trees and headed straight towards her. And as it did, Patty immediately told her friend on the phone that she'd just have to call them back. Over 7 hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Patty's close friend, Phyllis Neighbors, received a call from a mutual friend from the dance club. And as soon as Phyllis answered the phone, this mutual friend said he was very worried about Patty. Patty was supposed to pick him up to take him to a doctor's appointment, but she had never showed up and was not returning his phone calls, and this was totally unlike her. Over the next hour, Phyllis tried to reach Patty several times without any success. So eventually, she called another friend from the club, Barbara Ricketts, and told her that she couldn't get in touch with Patty, and she had this bad feeling that something might be wrong. Barbara said she had also been trying to get in touch with Patty and had not been able to reach her all day. And so at this point, Phyllis said that she was just going to drive out to Patty's house to see what was going on. But Barbara told Phyllis to hold on a minute and stay put and wait for her. She wasn't letting her go out there alone. By the time Phyllis and Barbara finally got to Patty's place, it was starting to get pretty dark. Barbara drove slowly and carefully up Patty's long gravel driveway because the light coming from inside Patty's house was actually the only thing guiding her way toward it. She parked right behind Patty's car, and the two women got out and started walking toward Patty's house. When they got close to the porch, they noticed something lying at the foot of the front door. Phyllis squinted and thought it looked like a bunched-up rug. Phyllis climbed onto the steps to get a better look at the object, and when she reached the middle step, she suddenly froze. And then she gasped and quickly turned her face away. She stumbled back down the steps, grabbed her phone, and dialed 911. Texarkana police cruisers and an ambulance converged on Patty's house within minutes of Phyllis's call. A police officer stepped out of his car and turned on his flashlight. He scanned the area and saw Barbara sitting inside her car and crying, and then he saw Phyllis standing in front of the porch. Her hands were shaking and she was muttering to herself. The officer, along with 2 EMTs, began walking toward the house, and as they did, Phyllis looked up and saw them and went right over to them and then pointed back at the front porch and said they might as well send the ambulance away because they were too late. The officer walked past Phyllis, reached the front steps, and right away he saw what she was talking about. In front of the door to the house, there was a woman in a bathrobe, lying face up, gripping a cigarette in her right hand and clutching her chest with her left. And the officer noticed that her skin was pale and blotchy. One of the EMTs walked over and bent down to feel for a pulse, but he was already confident he was not going to find one. And when he actually felt the woman's cold, waxy skin, It confirmed that she was dead. The officer kneeled down and shined his light on the body, and he saw there were bloodstains in the woman's bathrobe and blood spatter on the wooden slats beneath her. And it became very clear that this woman did not die of natural causes. Minutes later, another car pulled up the driveway and 2 men stepped out. Texarkana police detectives Paul Knoll and Jason Hack, who were about as physically mismatched as 2 people could be. Knoll was round and bald, and Hack was tall and thin. They looked like an odd pairing, but these 2 men were actually almost always on the same page, and they were both sharp and meticulous investigators. Texarkana, Arkansas only had a few murders every year, so whenever Knoll and Hack got a call for a homicide, they knew it was not going to be an ordinary day at the office. And as they sized up their new crime scene, they could tell right away that this murder seemed especially out of the ordinary. The dead woman looked much older than the average murder victim in the area, and this neighborhood was more affluent than where they usually responded to violent crimes. Knoll and Hack quickly met with Phyllis and Barbara, but both women seemed so shaken they could barely talk. However, Phyllis did offer, in a very trembling voice, that the deceased was their friend, a woman named Patty Wheelington. Hack looked at the time and figured he should start canvassing the neighborhood while the neighbors were still awake. He told Knoll he'd be back in about an hour. As Hack walked to his car, he was struck by how eerily quiet it was. Even during the drive here, he had noticed how the woods seemed to isolate everything and how much land there was between each house. And as he pulled out onto the road to begin his canvassing, he didn't feel optimistic that any of Patty's neighbors would have witnessed anything. Meanwhile, Knoll stepped onto the front porch and began examining Patty's body and the area around her, trying to make sense of what had happened. For Knoll, there was no mistaking the 5 small, perfectly round wounds on Patty's body for anything other than gunshot wounds. He observed a bullet hole in the swivel chair where he guessed Patty had been sitting, and then another bullet hole in the bedroom window directly behind the chair. It looked as though the first shot was fired while Patty was seated, and it missed her. He then noticed another bullet lodged inside the front door of the house, which looked like yet another missed shot. Knoll took a step back, trying to picture the crime as it happened. He looked down at Patty and saw the cigarette wedged between her fingers, now burnt down to the filter. He noticed the way Patty's body was positioned, face up, with one knee raised, and Knoll visualized Patty leaping up from her chair after the first shots were fired and desperately trying to retreat into her house as more bullets hit her until she collapsed onto her back. From how quickly it looked like things had unfolded, and how the gunshot wounds appeared to have been fired from close range, this crime looked very intentional. It seemed like whoever had killed Patty had showed up on a mission, like they'd come here to kill Patty. Knoll looked through the hole in the back of the swivel chair, and then repositioned himself until he could see through the hole in the chair and also through the hole in the bedroom window, both at the same time, so they're aligned. This way, he could get a sense of the bullet's trajectory into the house. And while he was doing this, headlights suddenly swept across the porch as the coroner's van pulled up to the house. The coroner got out and met with Knoll, and Knoll told him he was free to remove the body. So, with the help of 2 police officers, the coroner lifted up Patty's body, placed it into a cadaver bag, and carried it off the porch. With the front door now clear, Knoll entered the home and went straight to the bedroom, where he found a .38 caliber slug on the bedroom floor, right where he calculated he would find it. He then began doing a walkthrough of the house, going from room to room, looking for any signs of ransacking or burglary. But nothing appeared out of place. In fact, it didn't look like Patty's killer ever entered the home. It was as if they drove up to the house, exited their car, immediately began firing, and once Patty was down, they got back into their car and drove away. Just as Knoll started a search of the kitchen, about an hour after he'd arrived, his partner, Detective Hack, walked in and quickly brought Knoll up to speed on what he had learned during his canvass of the neighborhood. Several of Patty's neighbors reported hearing gunshots around 8 a.m. that morning. After hearing this, Knoll looked over at the half-empty pot of coffee still on the kitchen counter. He'd seen Patty lying dead in her bathrobe, and she had obviously been dead for at least several hours before she was discovered, so it definitely seemed like she'd been killed that morning, possibly around 8 a.m. But then Knoll wondered why none of these neighbors had called the police if they heard gunshots that morning. Hack said he'd asked the neighbors the same question, and the explanation was pretty simple. People in that area fired their guns into the air all the time to scare geese out of their gardens or deer off their front lawns, so hearing gunshots would not exactly be cause for alarm. Then Nall started updating his partner on what he had found on the porch and inside the house as the two men searched the kitchen. But then suddenly, Nall stopped talking. He picked up several pieces of paper that were lying on the counter near the coffee pot, and as he read them over, he turned to Hack with a smile on his face. It looked like he had just found a huge piece of the puzzle. Nall handed over the papers to his partner, and after reading it over, Hack as well got the same look on his face. The first piece of paper was an invoice for a locksmith. Just a day earlier, Patty had paid someone to change all the locks on the doors to her house. Hack looked up at his partner with his eyebrows raised. If Patty was suddenly changing her locks at the house she'd lived in for years, it very likely meant she was afraid of someone who she knew well enough to maybe have a key to her house. Nall nodded in agreement and told him to wait until he saw what was on the other papers he'd handed him. And as Detective Hack started reading those papers, his mouth fell open and he started shaking his head side to side, because what he was looking at was Patty's life insurance policy. Each of the beneficiaries listed in the policy stood to gain $20,000 in the event of Patty's death, and the last two names on the list were Phyllis Neighbors and Barbara Ricketts, Patty's friends, who also were the two women who had found her body. Nall and Hack arranged for police escorts to bring Phyllis and Barbara down to the station, and when the two women got there, Nall and Hack interviewed them separately in two different rooms. Phyllis told Detective Nall that she had first met Patty at the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club about a decade earlier, and she had been very close with both Patty and Patty's husband, Ray, and so had Barbara. Nall asked Phyllis if she knew that she and Barbara were beneficiaries on Patty's life insurance policy, and Phyllis began laughing and nodding. Nall couldn't tell if this laughter was maybe nervous laughter, or if it was designed to mask just how important this money may be to her. Phyllis kept on laughing and said Nall's question had reminded her that when she first learned that she and Barbara were beneficiaries, she had jokingly said, "Oh, real cool, Patty. You're younger than all of us. We'll all be dead before we see this money." Nall smiled at Phyllis and sort of played along like this was a good joke, but secretly, he thought that everything Phyllis was saying and doing made her seem a little bit suspicious. So, after she stopped laughing, Nall asked her to go through her day to help him establish a timeline, hoping that, if she was involved, she would implicate herself. Phyllis said she woke up at 8 that morning, and then sometime around 10, she sent Patty a text message. Phyllis said she didn't really think anything of it when Patty did not reply. She just assumed that Patty was still asleep, and then she got distracted when her friend came over to watch a television game show with her. Nall nodded and wrote everything down that Phyllis said, but privately, he wondered if maybe she had sent that text message to Patty just to throw off investigators and make it look like she'd been innocently trying to reach her friend on the morning of her murder. In the next room over, Detective Hack was asking Barbara a similar round of questions. And, like Phyllis, Barbara had an alibi. She said she was with her husband all day, and her husband could verify this. Hack leaned back in his chair and looked across the table at Barbara. As much as he tried to picture Barbara as Patty's killer, he just couldn't see it. Barbara reminded him of his grandma, and she looked so utterly shaken by her friend's death that it was hard not to feel sorry for her. But Hack had enough experience to know that he should never take anyone's emotional state at face value. This could all just be an act. And so as he sat listening to Barbara talk, he found himself calculating in his head how much money Barbara may have been willing to pay someone else to kill Patty in order to still turn a profit on that $20,000 life insurance payout. It was after 9 p.m. by the time Detectives Nall and Hack wrapped up their interviews, but they didn't want to stop working right now when they felt like their investigation was really starting to take shape. And so after Phyllis and Barbara left the police station, the detectives began going through the text messages and recent calls on Patty's phone. They hoped they might find something that would give them more information on Patty's two friends. But none of the text messages between the women seemed in any way out of the ordinary. Instead, the detectives discovered something strange that they hadn't even been looking for. One of Patty's most frequent correspondents was someone she had saved in her contacts only as MF. Patty and MF communicated multiple times every day, and it was clear by reading their messages that this was more than just a friendly relationship. This was romantic. And it was also suspiciously discreet. Everyone else in Patty's contact list had been saved under their first and last names, except for this one person. Hack ran MF's phone number through a reverse directory, but all he was able to determine was that it was a mobile phone number, because the directory only gave him the name of the carrier, not the name that the phone number was registered to. And so he would need help from the phone company to find out who this number actually belonged to. But he also knew at this time of night that could be very difficult to make happen, and it could take a while. So Hack handed over that task to other members of the investigative team. And while he and Detective Nall waited for the results, they started tracking down and calling members of the Guys and Dolls Square Dance Club. Even though it was getting late, several of the members answered their phones and were actually quite eager to help the police. None of the members could think of anyone with the initials MF, but Hack and Nall quickly discovered that these people loved to gossip. Several of them told the detectives that rumors had been circulating for a while that Patty was having an affair with a married club member, a man named James Hyatt. And as soon as Detective Nall and Hack heard this name, they stared at each other in shock. This was not the first time in this investigation that they had run across James Hyatt, because James Hyatt was the third beneficiary on Patty's life insurance policy, right behind Phyllis and Barbara. In the event of Patty's death, James, like Phyllis and Barbara, stood to receive $20,000. And so now the detectives had 3 possible suspects: Phyllis, Barbara, and James. And they also started to wonder if maybe all 3 of them had conspired together to kill Patty for the insurance money. In their conversations with Guys and Dolls Club members, Nall and Hack learned that James was married and he had known Patty for years. Patty and her husband, Ray, used to go out on double dates with James and his wife, and they had become even closer with James in 2008 when they hired him as a contractor to help restore their fire-ravaged house. In fact, Patty and Ray had trusted James so much that they had made him the executor of their wills. This definitely seemed like a guy who Patty and Ray might have given a house key to. So the detectives thought, maybe James was the person Patty had changed her locks to try to keep out. As the detectives were working through this potential theory in Nall's office, the door opened and an excited young cop walked in. He said they'd gotten lucky. The phone company had been able to help them and gave them the name connected to the MF phone number in Patty's contacts. And it was a burner phone for James Hyatt. Nall and Hack immediately got in their car and drove across town towards James's house. They still considered Phyllis and Barbara suspects, and they thought there was a chance the women had worked together with James. But based on the text messages the detectives had found between Patty and this MF person, and now the burner phone, it seemed pretty clear that James and Patty were having an affair, which automatically made James a major suspect in his own right. On top of that, it made it even more likely James would have had a key to Patty's house, and as a final strike against him, he had something to gain financially from Patty's death. The detectives arrived at James's house, but his wife Virginia came to the door and told them James wasn't home. In fact, she had no idea where he was, and she was starting to worry that he might have just left town or something without telling her. And now, the detectives realized they might be looking at a fleeing suspect. They told Virginia to contact them if she heard from her husband and to please keep her phone close by in case they needed to follow up with her. And Virginia said she would. Nall and Hack got in their car and headed right back to the station. It was late and they were both very tired, but now this was starting to feel like a case they could close before sunrise. They just had to find James. Detective Nall walked into his office and called James's main phone, not the burner phone. There was no answer, but Nall was relentless. He just kept calling over and over and over, and finally, after a bunch of tries, Nall heard James answer. Before James could say anything other than hello, Nall introduced himself and told James why he was calling. But James cut him off, saying he'd already gotten the news of Patty's death, and so this would just have to wait, because he was out of town. Nall couldn't believe how arrogant and dismissive James sounded, and he was not convinced James was actually out of town. But either way, the detective knew he could not let James off the phone and risk having him disappear for good. Usually, Nall liked to interview his primary suspects in person, but he knew he could not wait for a face-to-face meeting with James. So Nall just launched into an interview right there on the phone. He told James that police knew all about the burner phone and his affair with Patty. There was no point in trying to hide those things. James immediately went silent, and there was a long pause, and then when he started talking again, all of the arrogance Nall had sensed just minutes ago was gone. James sighed and admitted that he and Patty were romantically involved. He only had the burner phone and the different name in her contacts to protect Patty's reputation. After all, he said, people in this town don't look too kindly upon adultery, and the other woman often gets blamed in these situations. So he just never wanted any of this to get out to protect her. Detective Nall doubted that it was really Patty's reputation James was trying to protect, and not his own, or his marriage. He asked James if Patty had ever demanded that he leave his wife, but James said she hadn't. In fact, he said Patty pleaded with him specifically to stay with his wife. Finally, Nall asked James where he was on the morning Patty had been killed. James said he'd been in Florida, where he still was, and so he was 1,000 miles away from Texarkana when Patty died. Nall knew that there was an easy way to either prove or disprove this, and that was by getting the location data for James's mobile numbers and seeing what cell towers they pinged. So he told James one more time that he needed to get back to Arkansas right away. As soon as Nall hung up, he and Detective Hack put in a request for a subpoena so they could get James's cell phone records. They knew that request would take a little time to be fulfilled, so in the meantime, they reached back out to James's wife, Virginia. They said they knew it was late, but they needed to talk to her. And not long after the call, the detectives drove back to James and Virginia's house, picked her up, and brought her back to the station. And by the time they arrived there, Detectives Nall and Hack weren't even sure if it was considered late at night or early in the morning. They just thanked her for coming in at such a strange time, and they led her into a large office with a conference table. Virginia sat down across from them, and for a second, neither of the detectives spoke. This was not a situation that either of them wanted to be in. But, finally, Hack looked across the table at Virginia and asked her if she was aware that her husband James had been having an affair with Patty. Virginia gave a little smile and said she knew it might sound strange to them, but she knew all about the affair. Hack and Nall shared a quick look, like what was going on here, and then Virginia told them that she and Patty were friends, and there were no problems between them at all. Now, neither of the detectives had expected this response, but they knew there were all different kinds of marriages out there. Maybe Virginia and James had an open marriage, or maybe James's affair with Patty somehow made his and Virginia's marriage stronger. They were not there to pick apart the exact nature of this relationship, but they did think there was a chance Virginia might have information that could directly connect James to Patty's murder, even if she didn't know it. And so Hack asked if Virginia remembered where her husband was when Patty was killed. Had Virginia seen James or even called or texted with him? Virginia said she hadn't seen James at all. She had woken up around 8 a.m. that morning, and she drove straight to a fast food restaurant to buy breakfast for her mother, who lived in a nursing home. After spending some time with her mom, she had gone home, and she said James had already been gone when she woke up, and he wasn't home when she got back, and they hadn't talked on the phone at all. The detectives excused themselves and stepped out into the hall. They had some new information, but nothing that would enable them to close the case or prove if any of their potential suspects were actually where they claimed to be at the time of the murder. They needed James's cell phone data. If his phone had been picked up by one of the cell phone towers near Patty's house on the morning of the murder, they would know he'd lied to them about being in Florida at the time of the murder. Luckily, it didn't take long for the phone company to come through yet again. Now, almost exactly 1 day after Patty's murder, Detectives Hack and Nall received James's cell phone tower data, which showed his location and movements throughout the morning of the murder. They also obtained surveillance footage from multiple locations around town, and that footage was the final piece of evidence they needed. It had taken just 24 hours, but the detectives now knew who had killed Patty Willington. Based on video footage, cell phone data, the interviews conducted, and other evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Patty on the morning of December 3rd, 2013. . Just before sunrise, the killer got out of bed after yet another sleepless night, and they told themselves there was only one way to find peace again. They had to kill Patty Wheelington. They went to their closet and collected their .38 revolver. As the sun began to rise, they slipped the gun into their pocket, marched out to their car, and began driving towards Patty's house on the outskirts of the city. The killer pulled into the long driveway leading to Patty's house, and as they approached, they saw Patty sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette and talking on her phone. The killer got out of their car and began walking toward Patty, who quickly put her phone down and greeted the killer. But the killer was not interested in talking. Instead, they drew their revolver and aimed it at Patty. Patty saw the gun and tried to reason with them, but the killer just fired off a shot. The bullet missed Patty and went through the bedroom window behind her, and Patty jumped up with her cigarette still in her hand, but before she could even turn, the killer had fired again, and this time the bullet hit Patty in the chest, puncturing her lung. Patty clutched her chest and struggled to breathe. She lurched toward her front door, but the killer kept on firing, hitting Patty 4 more times, including a bullet that struck Patty right in the heart. Patty's legs buckled and she collapsed on the porch, still clutching her cigarette in one hand and her chest in the other. And as the killer watched Patty fall, a sudden sense of peace did come over them. The killer walked back to their car, started the engine, and drove away as Patty lied at the foot of her front door, dying. A little while later, the killer stopped along an isolated road, disposed of their gun, and then continued on home. Over an hour later, at about 9:15 a.m., the killer drove to a fast food drive-thru and ordered a sausage biscuit. And at 9:42 a.m., the killer walked into a nursing home to see their mother and give her the fast food breakfast. And later that day, the killer returned home and waited for the sun to set, looking forward to their first good night's sleep since they discovered that their husband was having an affair with Patty Wheelington. James Hyatt, who had been a strong suspect at the beginning of the investigation, did not kill Patty. His wife, Virginia, did. James's cell phone data proved he was in Florida at the time of Patty's death, just like he had told the police. This information led investigators to immediately turn their focus on Virginia, who they had considered a suspect from the moment they learned she knew about James and Patty's affair. So investigators obtained surveillance footage from the McDonald's drive-thru and the nursing home, places Virginia told detectives she had visited on the morning Patty was killed, and those videos showed that Virginia had visited both of those places, but she lied about the times that she was there. And surveillance footage from a convenience store along the route between Virginia's house and Patty's showed Virginia's car heading towards Patty's house right around the time it was believed Patty was killed, and then also driving back to her own house not long after. With that information, police served a search warrant on Virginia's house. Although they didn't find the revolver, they did find a box of .38 caliber ammunition, and they found the blouse that Virginia was seen wearing in the surveillance footage from that morning. They sent the blouse to the crime lab, and it came back positive for gunshot residue. It turned out, ever since Virginia began to suspect that her husband was having an affair with their good friend Patty, Virginia became increasingly possessive and unstable. And James, who had been married to Virginia for 41 years, had begun to grow afraid of his wife, to the point where he began sleeping in a separate bedroom and even began locking his bedroom door at night to keep his wife out. At Thanksgiving dinner with her in-laws, a week before Patty's murder, Virginia had taken James's sisters aside and told them she was concerned that James was going to commit suicide. But James's sisters knew him well enough to know that they did not believe this, and when they talked it over with James, the family became convinced that Virginia was actually planning to kill James and cover it up by the idea that he had killed himself. So, as a result of this, James had left town to stay with his sister in Florida, and while he was down there, he filed for divorce. And by coincidence, Patty had just happened to leave town around the same time as James left for Florida, which led Virginia to believe that Patty and James had run away together. So Virginia began calling Patty repeatedly, leaving voicemail after voicemail, begging Patty to return her husband to her. On December 2nd, Virginia was served with the divorce papers. And then that night, she was at the Square Dance Club, where she knew the other club members were whispering and gossiping about her husband's affair with Patty, and so she decided it was time to kill Patty. and the following morning, she would. Virginia was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. On March 11, 2020, the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak was so bad that it had become a global pandemic, which meant this new highly infectious disease had spread virtually everywhere on the planet. And so around the time this global pandemic announcement was made, governments around the world began instructing their citizens to stay home and avoid all physical contact with other people outside of the people that you lived with. The idea being these quarantine measures would help stop the spread of the virus. Initially, world leaders and citizens believed these quarantine measures would have a dramatic impact and it would stop the spread, and before long, COVID would be under control and life would just kind of magically go back to normal. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. By June, so 3 months into the global pandemic, positive COVID cases were only going up, not down. And so it was around that point in June that people all over the world were starting to come to terms with the reality that COVID was not this simple problem with a simple solution. It was a complex health issue that likely was going to be around for a long time, which also meant these strict quarantine measures also would likely be around for some time. Now, the efficacy of these quarantine measures were quickly called into question, and it was all over the news, and politicians, all they wanted to talk about was, do these measures work? Is it having an effect on the spread of the virus? But for everyday people, the real concern was not politics, it was practicality. How do you live a full and happy life in quarantine? In June of that year, 54-year-old Sandra Hughes was pondering that question. To that point, her life had really not gone the way she had planned it. She had been married, twice actually, but both relationships had ended in divorce, and she had never had children. She lived in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, but she hadn't really lived there long enough to consider it her home, and prior to that, for the bulk of her adult life, she'd kind of lived this nomad lifestyle, bouncing around all over the country, and so really she had never developed a home of sorts. She was an accountant by trade, but in college, she had studied not just accounting, but also wilderness survival, which she happened to be incredible at and was very passionate about. Growing up, she had always been a big outdoor enthusiast, and so she had always thought one day she would become a park ranger, and so that's why she was studying wilderness survival in college. But as these things go, after she graduated college, she did not become a park ranger, she became an accountant, and now, 30 years later, here she was. However, in June of that year, with COVID quarantine restrictions putting her and everyone else's life basically on pause, Sandra suddenly saw an opportunity, and that was to embrace this break from reality and spend this strange time in history back out in nature, getting back in touch with her roots as an outdoor survivalist. And so at the end of that June, Sandra would sell her place in Maui and she would move to Madera County, California, which is located smack dab in the center of California, situated just south of Yosemite National Park and just north of the Sierra National Forest. Then on June 26th, after Sandra had gotten settled in her new place in California, she would contact her family and tell them that she planned on going on this extended solo camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and that she would be in touch with them in the coming weeks when she was back out. To Sandra, this trip was going to bring her lots of happiness and fulfillment, and it was going to allow her to continue to adhere to quarantine guidelines because she'd be all alone. Shortly after speaking with her family on the 26th, Sandra loaded up all of her camping equipment into her silver Saab sedan, and then she would drive from her place south and then east a little over an hour until she was deep inside of the Sierra National Forest. At some point, she would leave the main road and she would hop onto a bumpy dirt road that kind of wound through the forest, and that road would bring her out to an area called the Johnson Meadows. The Johnson Meadows are absolutely gorgeous. It looks straight out of a postcard. It's basically a stretch of beautiful green meadows, and then around the perimeter of those meadows are the thick trees of the Sierra National Forest, and then beyond those trees are the snow-capped Sierra Mountains. But despite its beauty, the Johnson Meadows are actually fairly dangerous. It's a very isolated part of the Sierra National Forest, and there are lots of cougars and bears and other natural hazards in the area, so it's not really a place you go unless you're prepared to be there. And Sandra was certainly that, both in terms of her survival experience and the gear she brought with her. So when Sandra drove her car right up to the edge of the Johnson Meadows, she parked her car off to the side of the road so as not to block the road, and then she got out, she collected her things from the trunk, and then she threw it over her shoulder and began hiking into the middle of the Johnson Meadows to look for a place to set up her campsite. 6 days later, on July 2nd, some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows and began walking across the center of it. And as they're walking along, they notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. They don't see anybody near it, but they clearly see someone is camping in the middle of Johnson Meadows. And so this is totally not unusual. Lots of people go hiking and camping in this area. And so these hikers just began kind of creating a wide berth around this person's campsite because they didn't want to cut right through the middle of it as they went across the meadow. But as they're making this kind of wide berth around this campsite, they looked over at it, and as they passed by it, they noticed that the campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed, like a tornado had crossed right across it. And so when they were parallel with this campsite, the hikers decided to actually go over and look at it and see what was going on. And so they walked over to this campsite and they're looking around and they see there's a backpack that's clearly been dumped out and all of its contents are strewn around all over the ground. There's unopened cans of food, there's papers and documents, the tent is in ruins. I mean, the place is just a total mess. And so the hikers didn't really know what to make of this. They couldn't tell if a person had kind of intentionally ransacked this site or if maybe an animal had come through. But as a precaution, they marked down on their map where this destroyed campsite was, and then they hiked out of the forest. And when they were back in cell phone range, they called the Madera County Sheriff's Office and they reported the site. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows, and sure enough, the campsite is still there, it's still in ruins, and it's still abandoned. And so they would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would leave the forest and get in touch with Sandra's family to find out if they knew why Sandra had left her campsite the way she had. But when Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they had an immediate and definitive reaction to it. They told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious and was very cleanly, and so she would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. The family would also tell the sheriffs that they had not spoken with Sandra since the 26th when she started her trip, and so they had no idea where she could be now. And so naturally, the family was concerned, the sheriffs were concerned, and so that day they filed an official missing person report. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched in Johnson Meadows and the surrounding area to look for Sandra. And so hundreds of people were out on foot, they had sniffer dogs out, there were helicopters in the air, and during the search, the Madera County Sheriff's Office was interviewing anybody who was out there, hikers, campers, and asking them if they had had any contact with Sandra, because Sandra was actually quite distinctive looking. Before she left for this trip, she had dyed her hair blue. But unfortunately, no one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then on July 4th, so 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. And as these hikers walked past her, they definitely noticed her, but she didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. they just kind of saw this person minding their own business and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office got really jazzed up. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, on July 5th, Sandra's vehicle was located, but Sandra was not with it. It was found 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was in Johnson Meadows, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine, and this ravine was right next to a winding forest road. And so after looking at the damage on the front of the car, authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. There was no blood inside the vehicle, so it wasn't immediately clear if this accident had actually done any physical harm to Sandra. But the most significant thing about the discovery of this vehicle was the state of Sandra's personal effects that had been in the vehicle. Clearly, after the vehicle had come to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car, all of Sandra's personal things, and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor, as if they were kind of rummaging through her car looking for something, throwing things as they went. And the Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked in Johnson Meadows, where all of her personal effects had just kind of been chucked all over the place. At this point, authorities did not believe Sandra was actively trying to evade them. Instead, they thought, maybe Sandra got hurt, maybe back at the campsite or even during this car accident, and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. There was some discussion about foul play maybe being involved, but that was largely discounted. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was at the bottom of the ravine, thinking, maybe Sandra is going to come back to this vehicle, and maybe that's why all these things have been strewn around, because she's coming back and looking for something. And so authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey, Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number if you see this. And then at the bottom of this note, it said, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days with a new focus around the area where the car had been found, but nothing new was discovered. Then, on the evening of July 12th, so 1 week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers had made their way 2.5 miles north of the vehicle, and they were actually inside of Yosemite National Park. They were barely inside, and they were right up along this lake called the Spotted Lake. Now, this is an area that's very difficult to get to. There are no main roads that get there. There are no main trails that get there. And so the searchers, they're up in this very rugged part of Yosemite. And as they're walking along with their flashlights out, they see a sleeping bag, and it's laying out right in the middle of the ground, in the middle of nowhere. And it looks like it's been used recently. And it would turn out that sleeping bag was Sandra's. But again, when they brought all the searchers out to that area and they searched all around the Spotted Lake and all over this area, there was no sign of Sandra. At this point, authorities were totally baffled. On a map, Johnson Meadows, where her first campsite was, then her vehicle, and then this sleeping bag were all more or less in a straight line going south to north. It was almost like Sandra, from the day she went missing, had just begun slowly working her way to the north, but she was doing it without any equipment and most likely barefoot in an area that was steep and rugged and dangerous and full of cougars and bears. And so authorities knew if they didn't find her soon, even if she was doing this on purpose, she was likely going to succumb to the elements. The search for Sandra would continue for another week after the discovery of her sleeping bag, but by that time, by July 20th, there hadn't been any new developments. No one had seen Sandra, there were no new leads, and so unfortunately, the authorities had to scale back their search. About 3 weeks later, on August 9th, 2 hunters were driving down this very desolate forest road, located several miles to the east of where Sandra's car had been found. And as they're driving along, they turn this corner, and as soon as they do, they look up ahead and they see there's this woman.
Now, she's not standing on the road or even right next to the road. She's kind of tucked up a ways on this hillside in the trees, and she's leaning up against a tree. And so the hunters are looking at her and they're seeing that she's got no equipment with her. There's no backpack, there's nothing, no tent, and there's no other people anywhere. I mean, they're in a very isolated part of this forest, and it's odd to see people here to begin with, let alone this woman who's just kind of casually standing up against a tree. And so the hunters, they're like, okay, let's drive up and see if she needs something. And so they pull up right up alongside her. She's still, 10, 15 feet away from them, tucked up in the trees. And so they roll their windows down and they're looking up at her, trying to kind of flag her and get her attention. But the woman is not paying attention to them at all. She just continues to prop herself up against this tree and just kind of stares off into the distance. And so the hunters, they're looking up at her thinking, what's going on with this woman? And they kind of called out to her. They tried to wave her down, but there was nothing. There was no interactions with them. And so ultimately the hunters thought, okay, well, we don't know what this woman's doing, but it seems like she's here on purpose and she doesn't seem like she's in distress. She doesn't look hurt. And so they just decided to carry on. And so they drove off, and then later that day, they would see one of the missing person flyers for Sandra Hughes, and they saw the blue hair in the picture, and they were like, oh my goodness, the woman we saw standing up against the tree in the middle of the forest was that woman, Sandra Hughes. The hunters would contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office and report this sighting, and they would describe Sandra as looking slightly thinner than the picture of her on her missing person flyer, and they would also say she was wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt, which was interesting to sheriffs because the last time Sandra was sighted, which was on July 4th, when those hikers had seen her barefoot with a bruise on her face near Johnson Meadows, she had been wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. And so clearly she had changed her outfit, but that didn't really make any sense because she had left all of her things at the campsite and her car, and so the whole situation was just totally weird to the sheriffs. But regardless, they headed out to that road where the hunters had seen Sandra, but like always, Sandra was not there, and there was no sign she had ever been there. After this, Sandra's case went cold, and so authorities and her family began to brace for the reality that they likely would never see her again. But there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, on Wednesday, July 21st, 2021, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children were driving in Jake's off-roading vehicle up the steep forest road in the middle of Sierra National Forest on their way to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. Shut-Eye Peak is a mountain in the Sierra National Forest with stunning panoramic views from the top, and it's located about 5 miles to the south of Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. So Jake and his family, they're driving their way up this long, bumpy, winding forest road, making their way towards the top of Shut-Eye Peak, and when they get about halfway, the kids in the back start complaining that they're hungry. And so Jake and Victoria, they decide, you know what, let's just pull over at the next natural stopping point, and we'll have a quick lunch, and then we'll continue on the rest of the way. And as luck would have it, the road they were on would actually level off and lead them to this kind of short, flat section of the mountain. And in this flat section was this beautiful little meadow that butted up against some trees. And so Jake and his wife thought this is a great place to stop and have a little picnic. And so he pulled his truck over on the side of the road, he parked it, he turned the engine off, and then as Jake and his wife are kind of gathering up their things before they get out of the vehicle to go prepare this picnic lunch, they hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, who's in the back seat right near a window, start talking. And so Jake and Victoria instinctively turned around to see who Caden was talking to, and they saw Caden was not talking to himself, he was not talking to his siblings, he was turned and looking out his open window, looking across this small meadow into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation with somebody outside. And so Jake and Victoria, they see their son, and they look out the window in the direction he's looking and talking, and they don't see anyone. And so Victoria, she looks at her son and goes, Caden, who are you talking to? And what he would say to her would send goosebumps all over her body. And in fact, what would happen over the next several minutes from that point onward was so unsettling that Jake and Victoria decided, you know what? We're not going to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. We're turning around and we're leaving. And so they would speed out of the forest and they would get back home. And that night, Victoria would make a Facebook post about what her son said and this terrifying ordeal they experienced on Shut-Eye Peak, and she would post it. And that night, the Madera County Sheriff's Office would reach out to Victoria via a Facebook message, and they would tell her, hey, we saw your post. Can we please speak to you and your son?" And so the next day, the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, and after speaking with Caden and hearing what he had to say, they would leave that exchange just as unsettled as Caden's parents. The day before, when Victoria turned around and looked at Caden and said, "Who are you talking to?" Caden would turn away from the window and look at his mom, and he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help," and he starts pointing out the window. And so again, Jake and Victoria, they look from their son back out the window into the tree line, which is where Caden is pointing, and they don't see anyone. And so they turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And Caden, at this point, he becomes emphatic and he says, "Mom, you gotta trust me. She's right there. She needs our help. She's lying face down, her legs are straight up, and she's dead." And so at this point, Victoria and Jake are looking at their son thinking, "What's going on here?" Jake promptly hops out of the car and just starts running into the woods to see what's going on. Is there a person out here? But he's out there looking around and there's no one. And while he's out there, his son is pointing in the direction of where he is, claiming there's this woman right near him. And so Jake's looking around thinking, there's no one out here. I have no idea what my son's on about. And so he's spooked. He runs back to the car. And when he gets inside, Caden is still looking out the window. He's pointing and he's talking to this dead woman that needs their help. And so Jake and Victoria, they were horrified, they turned around, they left. And then that night, when Victoria made that Facebook post, she included in the post what this woman apparently looked like based on what Caden said. And what Caden said was she had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. And so when the Madera County Sheriff's Office saw this post that described seeing a person in a black shirt, blue jeans, and blue hair, they knew that description matched Sandra Hughes. And so when the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And they went right up to Caden, and without giving him any extra information, they just showed him all these pictures of all these women. And they said, "Caden, can you identify in any of these pictures the woman you saw in the woods?" And Caden looks at these pictures, and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs, along with Caden and his father, they would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak to search the tree line near the meadow to see if there was any sign of Sandra or any indication that she had been there, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her, and nobody has any idea what to make of the very strange sightings of her that occurred after she went missing. It's all just one big mystery.
Dark up here, the air is clean and slow, leaving its pressure on the mark. We built the lens to steal the light, a million years across the void, but the truth revealed by the empty night is nothing we can feel or avoid. 0.6 parsecs away, a number that cannot be held, just data gathered day by day, and the silence that the cold stars yield. The scope is fixed, the mirror waits. What's inside is harder to define. The mind expands, the heart dilates on the edge of the infinite decide. Break the glass.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sign the 5-star review button up for your very casual, very friendly, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when it's their turn at bat, switch the machine out for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for